Good morning. Good to see you. To see anybody. So if you don't respond, pardon me, to the request to meet with Diane, and you have not been to the worship service across the plaza yet, the guy who is giving the sermon does a magic trick in the sermon. Look, I figured that he knew his content was really weak, and he had to do something to boist it up. Okay, let's begin in silence. May grace be in our minds and in our thinking. May grace be in our eyes and in our seeing. May grace be in our ears and in our speaking. May grace be in our mouths and in our speaking. May grace be in our hearts and in our understanding. And may grace be at our ends and at our departing. And no matter who you are or where you are in your spiritual journey, you're welcome here. Because I am preaching the first and the 11 o'clock service, I asked Dr. Dr. Hudley, to teach for us today. And I just want to, most of you know Holly, but maybe what you don't know is that Holly and I have known each other since she was an adolescent. And she's grown up and I still act like an adolescent. So I've watched Holly over a long period of time, but more than that, we're such dear friends. And Holly's on my gratitude list every day because we talk a lot. She's become such a dear friend of mine and someone I love enormously. And I've watched her over the years, as many of you have. And so those of you who don't remember, Holly and I were teaching about once a month before a little inconvenience called COVID hit. And on the Sunday that COVID hit, we were scheduled to co-teach. And of course, no one showed up because the church was closed. And I turned to Holly at the end of that time. We have such fun together talking and teaching. And I said, would you mind teaching next Sunday? Because I'm sure we're only going to be doing this for a couple of weeks. What was it, 2.5 years? And she did that every Sunday. Unless I was sick, she was sick, we were out of town or something. And it was great. And now she's got her PhD in something I can't pronounce. Evolutionary cosmology. She's got a practice in being a spiritual director. And it is my delight to introduce you to Dr. Holly Hudley.
That was funny. I like it when Bill introduces me. Yeah, it's not? I turned it on in my pocket, or maybe it's just not high enough. Let me, higher. It's going to be a little scratchy for a second. Sorry. How's that? A little better? Maybe I just need to yell a little louder. I actually had this on my slideshow, so there you go. You are welcome and celebrated here. It turns out that even though Bill and I are not teaching together, we're teaching parallel to one another today because we're both evidently talking about the importance of a daily spiritual practice. Yeah, you've heard that one before. And last week on the way out of class, Roddy asked me, so what are you going to talk to us about? And I said, a plant. You're not in the wrong class. This is not a horticultural. See, I can't even say it, so it's obviously not a oh my God, horticulture lecture. Thank you. But I have this very ordinary plant who is somewhat of a miracle in my garden. It sort of served as the inspiration for this talk this week. The last 2 winters have been hard on my garden, anyone else's, deep freezes, and then sandwiched in between was a really hot summer. So a lot of plants were just crippled by that. And some are only just starting to come back after about a year and a half of dying. We'll see how long that goes this year. But one thing that I have in my garden is a succulent bed. I love succulents. And they don't love extremes. They can do dry heat, but they can't do scalding heat for very long because it soaks up all the water that they've saved. And so last summer caused a lot of my plants to kind of limp into this past fall and winter. And this freeze that we had in February finished off a bunch of them. So I ended up having to replace probably about 75% of them that were already stressed, except for this one. And it is not very extraordinary looking, but it has an extraordinary story. It's a pretty innocuous plant, and it looks like this in bloom. It's a pretty little bloom. Mine's never done that. But after the freeze of this past year, it more or less caved in on itself from the top. And it turned brown and mushy, so that top part is kind of mushing in on itself. But the lower half of the plant remained intact. I went to replace it one day last year, and I noticed what was happening after the first freeze was that brown mushiness that had caved in was growing a whole new plant through the middle of it. So that's what you see there, is that bottom piece with a little brown ring, and then the top piece is the second plant that came up through the middle of the first plant. So I decided to just let it be and see what happened. Summer, fall, another freeze. After this year's freeze, that top part again, became really mushy and brown and kind of caved in on itself, and I'm just waiting to see if yet another part of the plant will grow up out of it. I noticed how much it had changed from this crisis, from looking like it was caving in on itself to growing up through the middle of itself. So this plant has healed itself from the inside out. It's grown a whole new self in some ways. Or maybe this was the self that was always within and it just got revealed through the process of injury and repair. Suffering does make room for change. Winter makes room for spring. Death makes room for life. This plant is so completely ordinary, and it's literally kind of surrounded by all these green, thriving plants, but I'm not removing it. It really is representing for me this feeling of resilience and healing, and I'm rooting for it. Aren't we all just trying to heal from the inside out? So I hope by the end of this talk, what you realize is how much you have in common with this blue myrtle cactus, both in your ordinariness and in your miraculousness. How many of you in this room, just show of hands or nod of the head, have had what you might call a kind of mystical experience? It could be a fleeting feeling. It might be an experience of extreme peace, a feeling of oneness. It might have been a shock to the system, something like a near-death experience even, that brought you to your knees. I'm thinking my plant had a kind of near-death experience. And transformative moments like this are deeply studied. It's a known phenomenon, even if it's not fully understood. And even though we have a lot of writings that describe moments like this, so Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, St. Francis, these aren't scientifically documented experiences until William James wrote about them in the late 1800s and 1900s. And he gave a series of lectures that became a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience at the University of Edinburgh in 1901 and 1902, in which he documented, cataloged, and described spiritual experiences. But his work is limited. It only pertains to mainly European Christian men. And since then, we have access to a growing body of literature that describes the phenomenon of a mystical experience and puts it in an order, sequentializes it, and helps us to understand and integrate it. Generally speaking, and what I'm going to talk about today is an interfaith model. One has what we call an initial awakening, which is some kind of mystical invitation. This is sometimes called spiritual emergence or spiritual emergency. The emergence or emergency is followed by a lifestyle alignment, like kind of deciding what are healthy habits to keep and what are unhealthy habits to get rid of. It's a stripping down of the ego. During this time, you might experience what is called a dark night of the senses. So the sensory sort of inspiration and or stimulation that was once giving you joy or maybe even a bypass might start to become meaningless. Following this is a period of spiritual practice that aligns with the initial awakening. Finally, and not all who go through the emergence or emergency reach this state, there's the process of breakthrough. You can see where I'm going with this, that you can't get to the breakthrough without developing a daily spiritual practice. You're welcome, Bill. In the Christian tradition, this is known as the threefold way. It was written about by Saint Bonaventure in the 15th century. He was a Franciscan. It's a relatively simple way to think about how inner transformation unfolds because it contains a beginning, a middle, and an end. Although I think end is not a great way to say it. It's really more of a continuation and a re-entry into this cycle over and over again. The threefold way is initiated by this invitation that is not always pleasant. In the Christian wording, it's the spiritual emergency. This often gets pathologized as psychosis. So if you were to experience something that felt unordinary or out of body, a psychiatrist might call you crazy. It needs to be seen in the context of the whole person, of one's whole experience, culture, being, etc. A spiritual emergency can be a high moment, a peak moment, one that excites or elevates or amazes. It can also feel crazy-making, like an out-of-body experience. It could come about as a result of a tragedy or an awakening that one has in the midst of, in the throes of addiction. Following that initial event, which is really the emergence is the prelude. The process begins after the emergence in the threefold way. During this time of the descent, you experience what is called purgation. It's the beginning of the path, and it's hard, and it's challenging. Note the similarity between purgation and purgatory. It's an in-between time, can result in a period of dejection, depression, anxiety, or a feeling of overwhelm. One might withdraw from life for a time, or perpetually seek the high, so kind of try to go back to that emergence. Some do this through trying to seek it with hallucinogens or even drugs that might excite that feeling again. But we can't remain in that peak experience forever. It's impossible. We still have to tread on this earth and do things like make sandwiches, buy groceries, mow the grass, dry the dishes, replace plants in the garden. In The Kingdom Within, John Sanford writes that becoming spiritually conscious is an individuation process in which we disidentify from group consciousness. I called this process in my own work unbelonging. When we are awakened, we're incorporated into the experience, and we experience what John Sanford calls as divine anxiety. Going through this initial process of differentiating from the group, we might begin to realize that we need to take personal responsibility for our lives. We may also feel really alone, like who is out there that can relate to me? One woman, Claire Cameron, wrote her experience down in 1906. She writes, "Light, light, as sudden as lightning out of nowhere. It was all around me in a great tumbling waves of joy and peace and beautiful serenity. Life stood still, crystallized. The moment was a jewel, flawless, perfect, and shining with a radiance I had never known before. Life was calm and strong and beautiful beyond words, and it was all true. I knew it was true. I could see it here in the light. I stood on a peak. I was God, and about my head beat all the music of the spheres. Then Tim jumps up from his chair with a thud, and there was Father bending over Mother's worn shoe just the same, and here I was, wiping dishes and hanging cups up on the hooks. The moment passed. The light was out. Life was thick and gray again, without color, without song, without joy, without peace. It tasted like wool. It was heavy and slow and cold. There was only the evening sunlight through the window. It was funny that, but I would never, ever forget. So she has the peak experience almost immediately followed by this feeling of dejection because she couldn't remain there. In the Jewish mystical tradition, there's a story about 4 men called the 4 who enter paradise. And paradise is a garden, an orchard, surrounded by pure white marble from which water flows into the plants. This story is actually a warning that the path of awakening can be a tumultuous one. It starts like this. We were 4 who went into the paradise. 1 looked and died, and 1 looked and was smitten. A 3rd looked and cut the shoots off the tree of life, and the 4th went in peace and left in peace. These 4 scholars, who were all deeply religious men, experienced a spiritual awakening. Strolling through this heavenly garden, they saw something like the face of God. The first guy, Ben Azai, was overcome with shock, and he dies straight away. The second guy, Ben Zoma, a renowned scholar about whom it was said that if one dreamed of Ben Zoma, one would be blessed with great wisdom. He saw the face of God and went insane. The third guy, Acher, also an extraordinary scholar, could not make sense of this moment, and he actually began to doubt everything and was called a heretic, cast out of the Jewish faith. The fourth guy, Rabbi Akiva, who studied the Talmud and was already on a mystical path, came into the orchard and left in peace. In other words, he was the only one who could integrate this emergence without crisis or death. It's hard. There's several lessons here. Number 1, if this were baseball, you knew I was going to mention it. 1 in 4 isn't bad. 250 is a great batting average. The Astros, half of them are batting below 250, and we're in last place. They're in their own dark night of the baseball soul. I, too, am in a dark night of the baseball soul. Number 2, integrating and healing from significant spiritual experience is hard. Some of us get stuck in that low place, unable to claw our way out of it. It could be that the 4 men in the story represent 1 man who came to this 4 different times and only on the 4th time could integrate the experience. And finally, given the one who represents integration is described as having a spiritual practice, this must clearly be part of pulling us out of the dark night of the soul. In the New Testament, we're told that the spiritual path is the narrow way, like entering through the eye of a needle. Inhabiting that kingdom within is hard work that requires patience, persistence, and practice. This is the second step of the threefold way. This integration won't happen on its own. Once you have the experience, it's not like all of a sudden life just makes sense. In fact, it probably makes less sense. It creates disruption and confusion in our lives because we want to believe that that moment will create peace and that it's lasting. Josh once told me, my husband, that the very first time he ever played golf, he got a hole-in-one. I know. He's like, I'm good at this. It never happened again. He's not really a golfer. He doesn't practice. But he's played like 5 times in his life, and every other time it's been terrible. So the hole-in-one moment was the peak experience. But because he didn't practice, it didn't continue. This first hole-in-one moment is an initiation, that is an invitation to wake up and start doing the work of healing, like the plant, from the inside out. So back to the diagram. Spiritual practice is the middle of the threefold way, what we might call tending to the garden. It's the way out of purgatory, like my little blue myrtle. There's something in us that has the capacity to grow through dark nights or dark winters and into new springs. We have the capacity to thrive in spite of circumstances that attempt to break us down. We find references to this process throughout the Holy Scriptures. I'm beginning to think that all these kind of religious avatars are just further examples of how human beings come to know the true self. The holy stories are meant to give us hope that we too can heal from the inside out. We can transform, even in the most extraordinary circumstances. I kind of view sacred texts as examples of the evolution of consciousness, of evidence of becoming more human, not less. And as we develop spiritual practice, and they're not required to be serious, this is not like trying really hard it's like they can be playful, they can be fun, they can make you laugh. There emerges a new developing awareness that all things are in God, and God is in all things. We could call this cultivating a mystical consciousness. I think about Meister Eckhart's, the eye with which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. This is what some traditions call developing the third eye. It's when learning and knowing becomes wisdom, and growing in this cosmic understanding that all things are connected. Of course, as synchronicity would have it, and I hope you can sort of see the text, it's small. I came across the perfect Hafiz poem this week in my practice. It not only points to the importance of our childlike knowing or our intuition, and I'll read it, but also to this deeper sense of belonging to the universe as a whole. A child's mere pencil sketch is every religion's best description of God. Who then will ever take issue or argue over such a naive and innocent portrait? Surely the intelligent, compassionate, and wise would not bother with such. And who with a living heart would not encourage a child's art in hopes that someday, a great truth and work might be gifted to our world through their soul's strength, insights, and talents, and liberate and unite the spheres within a body, for inherent in true art is emancipation. And do you have worlds within yourself? Indeed. The night sky is a microcosm of you. The oil in the lamp sun burns come from forests you once were, from rich deposits you left. So our spiritual practice is not intended, it can be fun and playful, but it's also not intended to erase pain or unexplainable events. It's intended to call attention to them in new ways to help us integrate and grow in self-awareness. And in turn, self-awareness expands awareness of others. The body scan is one that I use regularly as a way to just kind of notice and check in. It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to work from your littlest toe to the top of your head, through every part of your body, and just ask, how are you today? Where do you feel pain? Where do you feel relief? It helps us to start to notice where we hold tension and where we can experience freedom. Or that shoulder that's up to the ear, where you can just kind of breathe into it and let it go. And if we can do that in these calm moments, we're more likely to take it out into difficult moments. Mindfulness, I will confess I'm getting a little tired of the word mindfulness, but I don't have a better word because it's become kind of this like pop culture, just be mindful, just practice mindfulness. But it's the word we have. But mindfulness is 4 things. 1, the quality of our attention. How are we attending? Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I'm over here making grocery lists and thinking about everything else I have to do, and it tells me a lot about my attention. The second is the nature of our intention. Is my intention to come in with curiosity, or am I coming in with judgment and self-blame? Third is whether we display a positive or negative attitude. Again, you can notice that between self-blame and curiosity. And fourth is to notice our thoughts. In practicing something as simple as the body scan, we begin to reorient and align around these 4 things. It's a simple way to cultivate what we call the inner observer, which is necessary on all accounts for our own growth and for any hopes we have about changing the world. We cannot change something that we can't see. And practicing something like this helps us learn to see. And again, in this calm environment, we are more easily able to carry it out into more difficult situations if we can practice it without being triggered. In this practice, we also encounter self-judgment and likely feel frustrated by the presence. Then we start to judge our judgment, and we mire ourselves into this kind of spiral of shame. A woman I love, Reverend Thandika, she writes about racial justice and the need to address it in more spiritually oriented ways. So this is an investigation you can do when you do feel triggered. Why did I react in this way? What am I noticing? But she writes, when we get in that spiral of shame, we have to notice that shame is the death of an unloved part of the self, an emotional display of a hidden civil war. So if we can invite ourselves to get curious and start to tame the civil war, we begin to remember ourselves back into wholeness. We recall those parts of us that once felt shamed, isolated, or alone. And noticing our judgment is an opportunity, not only to bring yourself back in the moment, but also to try again with more compassion. To speak to yourself as you might speak to a 5-year-old who messes up. You wouldn't go, shame on you. You'd go, it's okay. I still love you. If a kid can't tie her shoe, you don't say shame on you. You say, it's okay. Let me help you. This is a practice that's available to us every day. And I promise that if you can cultivate unconditional positive regard toward the self, you can start to do it for others. You start to see others as more human, as more whole. You can do this at least until the next time your teenage son pisses you off. And then it's your turn to take their face in your hands and go, I'm so sorry. I love you. You're okay. My kids gave me that chance every single day. The middle of the threefold way is illumination. This is the springtime, an awakening in which our branches are broadening and death gives way to new life. Remember our plant. It's coming back. I can feel it. Just imagine what it took for this second inner body to push up and out through the first one. The change on the inside starts to become visible on the outside. It is not perfect. It is far from perfect. But to me, it is no less beautiful. It's so strange how change has both this expansive and constrictive impact on us. In spiritual practice, we're kind of stripping away as we're also growing up. So we're stripping away old layers and we're growing up out of ourselves. This is the point in the path where it's normal to encounter something like the dark night of the soul. Old stuff is shifting and discomfort arises. We so want to go back to what we knew, but we can't. We may find ourselves in this kind of chaotic dance of something old being destroyed and something new emerging. John Sanford in The Kingdom Within writes that change may feel like a violent attack from something dark and dreadful. For when the kingdom descends upon us, the experience is often a darkening of our old state of mind, so that a new consciousness can emerge. What arises out of persisting in your daily spiritual practice is union, or the breakthrough. This is the final stage of the threefold way. I say final, and as I said before, I really just mean a continuation. It can also toggle back again and again and again between purgation, illumination, and breakthrough. Because different moments require that practice of us again, and each time it deepens. Union does not mean that you'll never mess up, that you'll never have doubts, or that you'll never find yourself in another hole. It just means that you've arrived at some deeper level of knowing and trust that actually oneness does underpin everything. And when you feel disoriented again, because life will kick you in the butt, you get to zoom out and remember the threefold way. Oh yeah, practice helps. When I can start to integrate that experience, I can get to the breakthrough again. This greater sense of belonging holds us in times when we feel uncertain, small, and afraid. In this breakthrough, we're not disillusioned by separateness, even if we feel alone, and it can be lonely. Our behaviors and beliefs start to align, and there's this deep, abiding trust that we are okay. And I wonder if this isn't what Carl Jung meant when he said he didn't believe in God, but knew God. Paradoxically, the deeper our union, the more humble we become, the more aware we are of the ways that we have been psychologically and spiritually crippled, maimed, or blinded. It entails surrendering to the imperfection and being open to the things that can arise up out of it. In this stage of breakthrough, which isn't necessarily a permanent state of being. It's a permanent state of knowing. So you might not stay in this union state, but you know that it exists. The dividedness within and then our alienation from others is drawn into this kind of divine unity. We might come to call the union point a threading of the head and the heart. Our knowing and our feeling kind of start to align. I want to say that there's a shadow side to the threefold path. And really, I think to any process of spiritual awakening, almost everything I have read in this really frustrates me about our culture, and the language we use to describe this process is about is about the individual's path to wholeness. And I really want language that helps us to understand that I and we are connected, that as I become more whole, we all become more whole. And doing our individual work in the midst of this chaos that is our political system feels futile. All right, I'll just go back and I'll pray. Or I'll do the body scan. No amount of body scan is going to change what's happening. But what it can do is build community around awareness. So without having the perfect language of how to talk about we, I want to invite us to think about how our personal spiritual practice can facilitate collective action. It's true that if enough of us do our individual work, we do start to change the world. We become more aware and more conscious and more aware of the other. It is also true that none of us can do this in a vacuum. When we go, I have this, my kids had this little spot under the stairs that we called the cupboard under the stairs, like in Harry Potter. And for a while, it was where all the toys got stashed, and they had a chalkboard wall, and the art supplies were in there. But over time, it's just become a place to charge things. And so I co-opted it. And last December, 9 puppies were born in that hidey hole. We called it the hidey hole. We had a litter of 9 puppies that lived there for 8 weeks. And I then co-opted it and said, well, I'm going to turn this into my little meditation corner. So now it's this lovely little spot with pillows and lights and things I can hold and things I can listen to. And this is where I read poetry. This is where I sit and it's quiet. This is where I sometimes sit in distraction. But it doesn't happen in a vacuum. I can leave that space and immediately get thrown right back into irritation. The dog has eaten something. The kid has, the dog vomited up another sock. Whatever it is, this happens all the time in my house. My dog eats whole socks and then vomits them up. So I can come out of that space and walk right back out into irritation. But the hope is that I can walk out with just a little more awareness of my own triggers. We're not isolated beings. We can't stay in that vacuum. That closed, quiet room that's where we start to wrestle with intention. What is my intention here in doing a daily spiritual practice? And I love this question. How might I need to be in order for others to be free? An inquiry like this begins to change our outward stance. It draws us toward one another with more curiosity and compassion and openness. So there's liminal spaces between the stages of the threefold way, right? They're not just necessarily continuous, but you have these kind of thresholds. Am I going to keep going, or am I going to go back to what I knew? Am I going to keep going, or am I going to go back to what I knew? These liminal spaces are an in-between. Liminal is defined as uncertain transition between where you've been and where you're going. It's where the magic happens, too. I read a book. I'm sounding more and more like Bill as I get older. I have a book recommendation. It's called Toward Psychologies of Liberation, and it emphasizes the importance of our spiritual and psychological development in community, right? The more we can embrace this in community and with one another, the more we begin to heal the world. And she writes, the fabric of human life is woven with relationships. Once we thematize the importance of talking with one another, the multiplicity of ongoing and created situations in which dialogical skills can be nurtured abound. As we have seen, this requires us to slow down and turn toward each other, to have a clear sense of the relationship between our current footing in dialogue with one another and the future we are trying to create. That's how our practice comes outward. What is the future I am trying to create? And is this interaction helping us get there? Nurturing our ability to talk with one another, not just to or at, but with one another, is essential to human liberation. This is what it means to turn our spiritual practice outward. When we truly encounter the other as transcendent and holy, we're living out our practice. When we get curious about the other, we're living out our practice. When we take their face in our hands and say, "You're okay," we're living out our practice. The impact is twofold. We realize that our assumptions about the other were wrong, and our shared worlds grow considerably. That liminal space expands. The Western church has made spirituality largely individualistic. Your personal relationship with Jesus, your personal salvation, right? And psychology has over-pathologized the individual to the point where one person becomes the problem child in an entire system. Again, no one is created in a vacuum. We are impacted by our cultural, social, racial, and economic worlds. Spiritual practice helps us to attain freedom from this delusion that we're separate. And as we heal from the inside out, just like my little plant, with a willingness to examine biases and judgments, we also start to heal the world. We get more curious about the self, we get more curious about the world. There's this Greek, I didn't put that up, sorry about that. The Greek myth of Psyche and Aphrodite is this particularly powerful one about dissension and transformation. I'm going to give you a brief overview. So Psyche falls in love with Eros, who is neither God nor man. And in order to keep that love, she needs to undergo a set of challenges that the mother-in-law, Aphrodite, gives her, so that she can strip away all of her personas and masks, all of the false senses of self that keep her from really entering into love. She's symbolic of our own journey. Bill's leaving. Just say bye. Bye, Bill. He doesn't like what I'm saying. I'm just kidding. First, she has a spiritual awakening. She encounters love, a love that is so rich and so deep, that is greater than any ordinary human experience, and she's willing to take a major risk for it. Her first task is to separate seeds. And so she's given a big bag of seeds with all these various seeds inside of it, and Aphrodite tells her, you need to separate them each into their own bags in one night. So she falls into this great despair. She thinks, I can never do this. This is similar to separating the wheat from the chaff. This is like separating life-giving from life-draining, what takes away life from what gives life. She has helpers. The ants come in and help her. And they literally start taking out the individual seeds and putting them into piles, and she's able then to sort them into the bags. Aphrodite comes back. She's a little mad. She's also a little like, how did this woman do this? And Psyche's happy that she's kind of defeated Aphrodite. But what I want you to know is that she had helpers. She was not alone in this. She entered purgation alone. She had to separate what matters from what doesn't matter, but she had helpers along the way. Psyche is mute in her astonishment. Her senses here are depleted. And her next task is to retrieve the golden fleece from fire-breathing rams. If the rams so much as look at you, you'll burn to a crisp. This task feels even more impossible. She fears death. She's fallen into a deep despair. She's out of her mind with fear, but she has to go toward that fear with gentleness. She has to cultivate some kind of inner reserve where she can go toward the fear. And again with helpers, in her fear, she gets really quiet and she hears the wind and the reeds begin to whisper to her. If you look over here on the bush, there's some golden fleece stuck on it. You don't even have to touch the rams. You can get the gold by going around them. So she's able to kind of, in her sneaky way, get the golden fleece off of a bush without ever encountering the fire-breathing rams. I have never encountered a fire-breathing ram. Anyone in here? No. That would be terrifying. But she's able to steer clear of these fires of destruction, and something like hope, her own sense of strength and resolve starts to bloom in her. It clears a way for her to enter into the underworld. The gold fleece, of course, represents the discovery of something extremely valuable within. It's a kind of alchemical process. The third task she has to do is to fill a goblet of water from the river Styx. The river Styx surrounds Hades. It's a circular river that is constantly flowing with life and death. It represents the cycle of life. And once you cross the river Styx, you're in hell. You're dead. So the god who, is it Kronos now? I can't remember, that carries the dead into Hades is constantly ferrying between the living world and the dead. Again, she's terrified. How does she go into hell without dying? Because she must enter this river of life and death. And the goal here is to get one goblet of water, one goblet of clear water from the river Styx that she must carry back out to Aphrodite. Not the whole river, just a little bit. So she's needing to relate to this vast circle of life without overindulging in it. Even at this threshold, she's not alone. She has a bird who says, I'll help you out. I'll go down and I'll fill my beak with water and I'll come back up and I'll help you fill your cup. So this guide helps her. And the water, if you ever have water dreams, is a symbol of deepening consciousness, kind of getting deeper and deeper and deeper into the self. She's starting to see herself in this great flow of life as part of the river. Finally, the fourth task, once she's crossed this river, is to obtain some of Persephone's beauty ointment. Persephone is the goddess of the underworld, the most beautiful goddess. And she's certain that this beautiful goddess will deny her request. Why would Persephone give away her beauty secrets? So she has to prepare herself. She begins to practice. She begins to form rituals. She begins to cultivate the mind that will allow her to encounter this great beauty. And through practice and ritual, this is her trip deeper into the underworld. She has to resist temptations, and she has to rely on her own inner fortitude and her own strength. She greets Persephone. She doesn't become sycophantic. She doesn't pray at her feet. She just asks, can I have some of your beauty ointment? And Persephone gives her a tiny box. She says, sure, here you go. Lo and behold, the box is empty. So the discovery is that the beauty she seeks is within. There's nothing I can give you to make you more beautiful. Such a realization leads her toward union. She finds herself in the dark recesses of the inner world, and she only gets out through the help of others. She cannot do it alone. The ants, the winds and the reeds, the birds, all the creatures of Hades that she encounters that help her through the temptations. Our self-discovery is never solo. I could not survive this journey without my own guides. Recall the plant here. Our brownish, ordinary plant. There's Persephone in the underworld. The same one I began this lesson with. Its capacity for healing was always within. Yes, it needed the elements, the wind, the rain, the earth, the air. But this essential skill of healing was inside of it all along. It didn't get seduced by the underworld, by the dark winter, where it would have remained in a perpetual state of partial existence. Like Psyche, this little humble plant, and like us, we may have to fight and resist to overcome. Miracle of all miracles. This was a late add to my slideshow. I went outside to just look at this plant. What's going on with it? That's a little bloom. One tiny little bloom coming out of the side. This just popped out in the last couple of days. This plant is coming back to life. I just got teary. Like, how do I love this plant so much? It's just come to be such a great symbol of healing. What the descent into the underworld teaches us is to succumb to our inner wisdom and our capacity for healing from the inside out. It also teaches us to yield to the teachers, who never let go of the rope, no matter how deep we fall. There is someone always holding the rope, helping you to come back out. So here's the message. You are enough. You can heal from the inside out. Guides are available to you. And as you heal yourself, you heal the world. No matter where you go this week, no matter what happens, remember this: you carry precious cargo, so watch yourself. Thanks, y'all.